Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Lash. Earlier today, President Biden announced new restrictions on international travel in order to buy some time to study this new variant called Omicron. Watch.
I'm announcing today that all inbound international travelers must test within 1 day of departure, regardless of their vaccination status or nationality. This tighter testing timetable provides an added degree of protection as scientists continue to study the Omicron variant. And we are extending the requirement, both internationally and domestically, to wear masks for travel on aircraft, trains, public transportation through the winter months.
Now, the Omicron variant has already appeared in the United States. Yesterday, the Legacy Press went into overdrive, telling us about a single case of it in California. A second case has been confirmed now in Minnesota, and earlier today, a third out of Colorado. The administration says that new travel restrictions make sense, especially in light of the coming winter and growing fears about the new variant, which possibly evades current vaccines, even though it's super mild and the symptoms are unusual and it's very mild again. The president spent a lot of time today talking about all the ways the government's going to make it easier to get the whole family vaccinated. He outlined measures like launching more family vaccination clinics in an effort to get more kids vaccinated, distributing 50 million free tests throughout the country. Unfortunately, the people who've been contracting it have already been vaccinated. Now, as for the new international travel restrictions, you'll need to, again, show a negative COVID-19 test within 24 hours of your international flight, regardless of vaccination status or nationality. So it doesn't matter if you're already vaxxed. The current rule is that you have to test negative for COVID within 3 days of traveling internationally. That policy is over, and the negative test must now be within 24 hours. There were rumors of required testing upon landing and perhaps a required quarantine for 7 days as well, but that was not outlined in the policy announced today. The president also extended the mask requirement rule on planes all public transportation, planes, trains, and automobiles, subways, up until March 18th. And who knows, that'll probably be extended even after that. Biden says that if we all just get vaccinated, we can take our masks off more often and in more public places like crowded outdoor spaces. Yay. Biden apparently doesn't know that most of Texas and red state America hasn't worn a mask since early 2020. I haven't worn a mask in a year. Now, again, all of this comes as a response to the Omicron variant. Now, what do we know about the Omicron variant? Not a lot, except that the doctors that discovered it in South Africa, particularly Dr. Angelique Kotisi, had said that so far, people who do contract it, it's incredibly mild. It's a very, very mild variant. And we cannot play this clip enough because it shows how hysterical we have become about variants. This is Dr. Kotisi, who is the chair of the South African Medical Association. This is what she had to say about the hype around Omicron.
Looking at the mildness of the symptoms that we are seeing, currently there is no reason for panicking as we don't see severely ill patients. The hype that's been created currently out there in the media and worldwide doesn't correlate with the clinical picture.
Now, if we're living in reasonable times, reasonable people might conclude that we can all calm down. The doctor from South Africa also had some good news. The Omicron variant may well be mild, and yes, it's mutated, but then that's what viruses do. Usually they mutate to become more transmissible, and that makes them less virulent. And it's a good thing, and it appears, at least so far, that that's the case with Omicron. But we're not living in reasonable times, as you can see. We're living in very confused times with confused people leading our health agencies and creating very confusing policies. These are people who will actually lie to you and contradict themselves. They won't bat an eyelash about doing it. People like Dr. Fauci, who may well have helped give the world the virus to begin with by messing around with coronaviruses in a lab in Wuhan. I mean, who seriously is like, let's take this seriously deadly virus, potentially deadly virus, and let's mix it with whatever we find in a bat cave. Like, who decides that? But I digress. So when you're confused about how to handle a man-made virus and never-ending pandemic, it's best to bring out the most confusing human of all to answer questions about it. And so they did that. Dr. Fauci's back, right? Now with 25% more confusion, just in time for the holidays. Now Dr. Fauci wants you to know that all of these new restrictions, guys, they're just temporary, which of course is totally insulting because after 15 days to slow the spread was announced nearly 2 years ago, we all know that no COVID restriction is ever just temporary. Half of America still wears a face panty. And all the restrictions and all the mandates seem only ever to move in one direction. more strict and authoritarian mandates and rules. But that's not stopping. It's not stopping Fauci from coming out to tell you that we're all fine if we just do what Dr. Science says. So like Dorothy, we'll all get back to Kansas if we just follow the good doctor's confusing orders. But those orders are confusing, in fact. Here's Fauci trying to explain this new travel ban on South African countries where there is presently no Omicron detected. Watch.
What justify imposing a travel ban on countries that have 0 case of the Omicron variant?
You know, that's a very good question, an important question, and we did struggle with that, but we wanted to see if we could bide time temporarily. So I do hope that this gets sorted out and lifted before it has any significant impact on your country.
It's a great policy question that a doctor should not be answering. The doctor should only be talking about the virus and not the policies about travel. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, was he out there in front of the podium to discuss? Good grief. We're banning flights from countries that have 0 known cases of Omicron because he says he wants to buy time against a mild variant that doesn't exist in some of these banned countries. That's his answer. And yes, they're African countries, but it's not racist. I mean, not anymore anyway. It's only racist when Republicans do it, when they enact travel bans on any country that includes an African nation. Next question. Ooh, it's Ducey time. Peter Ducey, the only reporter who actually does his work beforehand and is willing to ask the administration a tough question. And that's what Peter Ducey did. Watch.
As you advise the president about the possibility of new testing requirements for people coming into this country, does that include everybody?
The answer is yes, because you know that the new regulation, if you want to call it that, is that anybody and everybody who's coming into the country needs to get a test within 24 hours of getting on the plane to come here.
Well, what about people who don't take a plane and just these border crossers coming in huge numbers?
You know, that's a different issue.
Yeah, that is a different issue, Dr. Fauci, one that is very confusing to Americans. You have tens of thousands of migrants who are illegally entering the country and pouring over the border, but not a single one gets a swab to the nostril. Everybody comes in, everybody gets a hot meal, everybody jumps on a plane or a bus, and they take whatever variant they may have with them, and nobody does anything about it. But an American citizen traveling internationally who is vaccinated has to get tested within 24 hours of flying internationally, and African countries that have no Omicron cases are banned from coming to America. Oh, and by the way, if you're one of those vaccinated American citizens and you decide to flout any one of the rules that people maybe entering illegally at the southern border flout, you could actually get anywhere from like a $3,000 to up to, what is it, something like $7,000 fine. I think that's also wrapped up in all of these new rules. Confusing. Yeah. So Dr. Confusion is writing the next prescription for a pandemic that he's failed to control from the beginning. But one thing that the good doctor is very much succeeding at is controlling you. In addition to the new temporary rules on international travel, the CDC and the federal government are continuing to attempt to force vaccinations of all private sector employees, healthcare workers, and police across the country. Get jabbed or you lose your benefits, and could even you lose your job. And there are some signs that maybe sanity is returning to America regarding these COVID policies and people's medical freedom. In Chicago, the attempt to force all police to get the jab via a lawsuit by the city of Chicago against the police union has been dropped. Now, Mayor Lori Lightfoot claims that the complaint became unnecessary as more officers complied. But on the other hand, the dropping of the lawsuit comes 1 month after a judge embarrassed Mayor Lightfoot by suspending her December 31st mandatory vax deadline. Now, we should point out that Chicago's vax mandate for police also caused concerns of a cop shortage at a time when the city was dealing with soaring, and is still dealing with soaring violent crime. Having previously cut significant amounts out of the police budget, Lightfoot has now backed putting more money into it amid worsening crime in her city. But the last thing that she needed was losing more officers to a vax mandate, so the city dropped the suit. And there's more good news of pushback against medical tyranny. A Louisiana judge delivered a nationwide block on Biden's vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. The federal judge's ruling puts an injunction on Biden's vaccine mandate for healthcare workers, and it applies to all 50 states. Now, the mandate from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, has required that healthcare workers in 21 different categories to be inoculated with one dose by December 6, 2021, and to receive the second dose by January 4th of next year. Failure to obtain vaccination by these dates would result in punitive action that included termination of the Medicare-Medicaid provider agreement. This mandate went into effect on November 5th of this year. CMS claims that the reason for imposing the mandate was, quote, in light of our responsibility to protect the health and safety of individuals providing and receiving care from services from Medicare and Medicaid certified providers and suppliers, and CMS's broad authority to establish health and safety regulations, we are compelled to require staff vaccinations for COVID-19 in these settings, end quote. Now, apart from the vax mandate raising serious constitutional concerns, the court found irreparable harm for petitioners deciding between their jobs or the vaccine. The document also said that the loss of constitutional freedoms for even minimal periods of time constitutes irreparable injury. This all comes on the heels of the federal injunction against OSHA's mandates requiring companies with over 100 employees to get vaccinated. Both OSHA and CMS mandates were deemed by the court as exceeding their power, as only Congress can legally enact new laws. The court found that there was a public interest in halting the OSHA mandate, saying that, quote, maintaining the country's constitutional structure and maintaining the liberty of individuals and to make intensely personal decisions, even when those decisions frustrate government officials, end quote. So even as the administration continues to impose tighter and stricter COVID mitigation policies on Americans, it seems our Constitution is asserting itself and pushing back. It does give you some hope that we're regaining some sanity. But it's not stopping the administration from using the pandemic and its latest variant to impose new restrictions on Americans wherever it can, and pushing for people who don't need to be vaccinated, like 5-year-olds. Why would the president do that? Why pump up the fear? Why impose more restrictions on travel for what may be a very mild variant? Well, one good reason is because the poll numbers are in the toilet. In a new poll from the Trafalgar Group, President Joe Biden's approval rating fell yet again to 36.3%, with more than half of registered voters strongly disapproving of his job, according to the results of this poll released Wednesday. The poll found that only 18.1% of respondents strongly approve of Biden's handling, with another 18% choosing approve as the answer. On the other hand, 52% of those polled said they strongly disapprove of the president's performance, and barely 7% opted for the option that read disapprove, bringing Biden's overall disapproval rating to 59%. So perhaps this helps explain the hyping of the Omicron variant. It's well known that when administrations are in trouble, there's nothing like some more trouble to bail you out, although sometimes a war fits the bill. A little skirmish somewhere to take the public's eye off the ball, like wag the dog, right? But in this case, the war is against a virus that no matter what you do, you can't get it under control because it's a virus. And the latest version, this variant, doesn't appear to be very virulent as of yet, but it doesn't matter. Wag the variant, that's the new game. Distract the American public, stop them from noticing the real threat, the authoritarian control that hides behind this variant and creeps further and further into the lives via regulation and claimed protections. These variants have proven too useful to not just this administration, but administrations the world over to be abandoned. And the more you hype the virus, the more you don't notice the imploding administration. It's the perfect scapegoat on which to blame everything, including bad polling. Now, at this point, the administration needs the pandemic, and that might explain why they keep hyping it. So returning to normal, that might return our attention to the real virus, authoritarianism. But we're not building back better, right? We seem to be getting sicker physically, mentally, and spiritually. So despite all the Biden administration's claims that they would get this pandemic under control, they haven't. They've allowed the virus and the federal government to gain further control of everyone without making anything safer and not shutting down the virus as they had once promised. Something to think about. So coming up, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr joins me to discuss Twitter's attack on independent journalism and how does that fit into its Section 230 protections. I've got some questions on this. And also, what about Biden's nominee for the FCC chair? Wait until you hear about this nominee. Stay with us. You have homeowners insurance for a reason, because without it, a fire, flood, or burglary could destroy you financially. But there's another major crime that your homeowner's policy doesn't cover, called home title fraud. Law enforcement calls title fraud one of the fastest growing crimes, and it can ruin you financially. That's why you need Home Title Lock. Title fraud happens when a criminal forges your signature on documents stating that you sold your home to them, and then they can take out loans against your home and leave you with the payments. You'll spend a fortune in legal fees trying to prove that you didn't commit fraud. Home Title Lock puts a barrier around your home's title, and the instant they detect anyone, from a cyber thief to a renter to a relative trying to forge their way under your home's title, they help shut it down. Visit HometitleLock.com, register your address to see if you're potentially a victim, and enter code radio for 30 free days of protection. Yesterday, we discussed Twitter's new policy that effectively muzzles independent journalism on their platform and will absolutely increase Twitter's corporate censorship more than we've ever seen, especially with Jack Dorsey now stepping down as CEO. Twitter is no longer a public square, according to their declaration in this new policy. So I'm curious as to how their redefinition of what privacy is in a public space, how does that factor into Section 230 exemptions? There's only one person I knew I could ask that would help us break all of this down, and that's FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. Commissioner, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining me on this issue, because Twitter, as you know, they came out with their new statement, and they're saying no private photos of anyone, which includes, I would imagine, not just still photography, but also video. And they're very intentionally vague terms. They say that it can't be considered unless it's already being covered by mainstream media, and that's the words that they actually use in their updated terms of service. And my question is, how does this impact 230 protections? Because we have the established reasonable expectation of privacy in public spaces. Would that be considered their sort of redefinition of this? Is that a form of editorialization, do you think? I mean, at least to impact that Good Samaritan protection?
Well, great to join you again, Dana. Look, I think you nailed it once again. I mean, look, you already have journalistic organizations, including the General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, saying that this new Twitter policy, in their words, will be undermining the ability to report newsworthy events. And when we had Twitter and social media, they used to come out and say, look, we represent the free speech wing of the free speech party. And the power of these organizations, these networks, was you could get around the traditional media gatekeepers and take your message directly to the people. And, you know, those days are over. And I think what this policy is just another way for Twitter to exert more control over what they're going to censor. And unfortunately, Section 230 allows exactly this kind of behavior, no matter what they call it. So really, the only path forward at this point is to reform Section 230 and then to go beyond Section 230 and impose some sort of core anti-discrimination obligations on these social media platforms.
Yeah, because that's the big question. I mean, and I think that because I've had this conversation with others, and obviously you understand it, isn't whether or not Twitter can do it. I mean, they're a private institution, they can do it, but the question then becomes that Good Samaritan protection of the Communications Decency Act of 230, which specifically says, look, if you're making a good faith attempt, and of course, obviously I'm abridging here, if you're making a good faith attempt to only limit things that are not protected forms of speech, then you have that Good Samaritan protection, and you don't have to rise to that legal liability level that a publisher does. And so that's why I think that it's odd that it's so also vaguely defined. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because this could be interpreted a million different ways.
Yeah, I think the vagueness is a feature, not a bug. Because again, what they can do with this vague standard is they can pick and choose. Do I want to censor this video or do I not? I mean, look, we have videos of Kenosha, of George Floyd. Massively news-breaking events are covered with videos that are going to have people in the background that haven't consented. And so through this policy now, they can shut down one of those videos that they don't like the narrative to. And I think that's just highly, highly dangerous. And again, I think all of this goes to show that we need regulation at this point. We don't want to go overboard. We don't want a big government solution. But this idea that we simply cannot regulate their content moderation doesn't make sense to me. Look, we got cable providers that in the 1990s, the FCC and Congress got together and said, look, we're going to regulate which channels you get to carry and which channels you can choose not to carry, because it was so critical back then to be on cable. Well, flash forward to today, and I'd submit to you that it's equally critical, if not more, to be on social media. If you're a candidate for office, are you really going to be able to get your message out there without being on Twitter? So just like we regulate what channels a cable company can or can't put up there, we need some baseline regulations that regulate the decisions that social media companies can make.
And that's kind of the $1 million question too. It's almost, it's at what point does a private company become a public utility?
It's a good question. Look, to me, at the end of the day, part of the challenge here is there's reports that the Biden administration has been coordinating directly with social media companies over takedown decisions. And that's a whole other line of basically First Amendment cases that says if there's that deep coordination, if the private actor is effectively an agent of the government, then they're effectively the government, meaning the First Amendment is going to apply to their behaviors. That's another reason why you could potentially argue that we need some regulation here.
Yeah, especially when you look at, and I always go back to that example, I think this was almost like a year ago now, or getting close to it, with the situation with Parler, when it was not just, it was Twitter and then Amazon Web Services. Very interestingly, after Twitter had signed a contract with Amazon Web Services to get the exact same sort of service to provide, to basic distribution is the best way I can put it. The same way that Amazon Web Services was working with hosting Parler, and then all of a sudden Parler was shut out of the game by Amazon Web Services, and all kinds of other payment facilitators and everyone else shut Parler out. And so then it does kind of become a question of, well, how much someone could always say, well, to counter regulating it as a public utility, just create your own thing. But when all of the other players in the game are on the same side and they can run you out of that public sphere, you can't.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, look, I love competition. I love free markets. My instinct is let's go with that in the first. But what we're seeing here, to your point, is different. When you have a competitor that starts up, whether it's Parler or otherwise, they get deplatformed. And so that's the challenge. And competition is great. I'd love to see more competition here. But we're at the point where we need more regulation. And again, I'm a little distrustful of big government, to put it mildly. But we can put some common sense, basic guardrails in place, some anti-discrimination rules. We have it in the civil rights context. We have rules that apply to cable providers. When we have net neutrality rules in place, those are restrictions on what ISPs, internet providers, can choose to carry or not. We need to take those same concepts and apply them to large technology companies. And I think this decision by Twitter reinforces it, because obviously market forces aren't working. People have asked for some basic things. Well, one, we want an edit button on Twitter. We're still waiting for that. But two, we want some clarity around content moderation and less censorship, not more. And Twitter's response is, you're not getting the edit button, but you're going to get more censorship. And so I think this is only going to end when we get some common sense government regulation here.
One other thing that I noticed about this, and this might be kind of secondary, but also kind of on the burner, because I know that there are people in the Biden administration that have been, calling, for instance, a return to the fairness doctrine, which is kind of insane. But the phrase where they were saying that unless it's being covered by mainstream media outlets, I feel like we're kind of being forced into a position of licensing media the way that you have credentials for all press. And I know that previously this was something that Democrats thought about doing and had sort of floated the idea, but I don't think it ever came to fruition, even within committee. I wanted to get your quick thoughts on that.
Well, the fairness doctrine was not very fair to conservatives. So for that and a variety of reasons, I'm a no on anything that looks like it's approaching that. And to your point, so much of the national news media coverage these days isn't actually journalism, isn't actually reporting. Not enough of it is. What a lot of it looks like to me is simply sheepdogging people towards preferred political narratives. And if we're going to use that as the standard as to what we get to speak about or show videos of on Twitter, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, definitely not. We so appreciate your time, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. Thank you so much, sir. Good to see you.
Thanks. Good to see you.
So coming up earlier today on my radio program, I spoke with attorney GLORIA ALLRED. She represents the script supervisor on the Rust film set, the one who was, according to the lawsuit, the first to call 911. And she's suing ALEC Baldwin for the tragic shooting death of the cinematographer and the injury of the director. You don't want to miss it. Back in a few. Black Rifle Coffee develops their explosive roast profiles with the same mission focus they've learned as military members. They've spent thousands of hours tasting, sourcing, and perfecting coffee from across the world Being founded and operated by veterans, Black Rifle Coffee knows what a quality cup of coffee means to active duty troops that are away from home for the holidays. Black Rifle Coffee is committed to supporting all who serve, and with every purchase you make, Black Rifle Coffee gives back. For every coffee purchase you make, a bag of their limited edition holiday roast will be sent to a service member overseas. So help support the cause and visit blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV. Check out the freshest coffee in America. blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV gets you 20% off coffee, apparel, gear, and 20% off of your first month of the coffee club. Welcome back to No Apologies. Earlier today on my radio program, I spoke with attorney Gloria ALLRED. She is seeking to hold ALEC Baldwin accountable. She represents Mamie Mitchell, who is the script supervisor for the Rust set. You remember that tragic shooting that took place that actually took the life of the cinematographer and wounded the director. ALLRED joined me earlier today on air to discuss. Watch. Supervisor for the film, Mamie Mitchell, has filed suit against Baldwin in this case, and representing her. Of course, she doesn't really need any introduction. Everyone knows Gloria ALLRED. She is representing Mamie Mitchell, and she joins us now to talk about this. And Gloria, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Dana.
I wanted to get your just initial response to this interview that's going to be with ALEC Baldwin and on ABC here coming later today. What is your response to his statement there? He says he says that the trigger just apparently magically went off.
Well, I really have decided that I want to see his interview, his full responses, not just a line or two here as a teaser. And then I will be responding tomorrow to what he has said. But when we filed our lawsuit recently on behalf of Mamie Mitchell, she was, as you said, the script supervisor, and she was standing very close in the line of fire, adjacent to Helena Hutchins, may she rest in peace, when the bullet that was discharged from ALEC Baldwin's gun hit Helena and tragically killed her, and then went and right through her and hit Joel Souza, the assistant director. My client, Mamie Mitchell, was very brave. She was physically, she was emotionally harmed by what happened. But even though she was in shock, she had the presence of mind to immediately run out of this small church and call 911. She is the first one to have called 911 and urged them to send help as soon as possible. So we did say and still feel that days before this shooting, there certainly was a warning that there were dangerous conditions on the set relating to guns and the discharge of guns. For example, a camera operator had reported 2 gun discharges during a rehearsal in a cabin. Quote, and this is what was in a text message that he sent: "This is super unsafe," end quote. And that's the message he sent to the production manager. And on the day of the shooting, Dana, union camera operators and their assistants had walked off the job to protest working conditions, including safety issues. And there are important industry safety protocols that are designed to ensure that firearms would be safely used, either in filming of motion pictures or on television. But those protocols, which were developed by labor and management industry-wide, were ignored, and actions were taken that we contend that were against all industry norms. And here's some examples of the failure to follow industry safety protocols. First of all, live ammunition was allowed onto the set of Rust, despite the fact that live ammunition is never to be used, nor is it to be brought onto any studio lot or stage. And second, the gun was handed to ALEC Baldwin by the assistant director, Mr. Halls. Guns are never to be handled by anyone other than the prop master or the armorer. And Mr. Baldwin, who is an industry veteran, knew that the gun in question should never have been given to him by the assistant director, and that he could not rely upon any statement by the assistant director as to whether or not the gun was safe to use. And this industry-wide safety bulletin for the use of firearms requires that all firearms are to be treated as though they are loaded. And Mr. Baldwin should have assumed that the gun in question was loaded, unless and until it was demonstrated to him that it was not, or it was checked by him that it was not loaded. So even if the assistant director made an alleged statement to Mr. Baldwin that the gun that he was handing to him was a, quote, cold gun, end quote, Mr. Baldwin should not have relied on such a statement. By the way, the industry norm is that it is the armorer who hands the gun to the actor and demonstrates to the actor, in this case, Mr. Baldwin, that the gun round or chamber is empty. And Mr. Baldwin knew that this was the norm and that it was not followed, and he did not check the gun himself. And further, the industry norm and safety bulletin requires that no one who shall be issued a firearm until he or she is trained in safe handling and safe use and the safety lock and the proper firing procedures. And Mr. Baldwin knew, or he should have known, that this was a safety protocol, and he chose to ignore it. And fifth, all guns and ammunition, Dana, are supposed to be secured throughout the production. And the armorer, in this case, Hannah Gutierrez, is required to keep all the guns and ammunition locked up or to stay with the guns until they're used. And instead, the armorer is alleged to have allowed guns and ammunition to be left unattended on a rolling cart outside the church at midday on Thursday during the lunch break. And that, of course, is the day of the incident. And six, safety bulletins, which are published by this industry-wide Labor Management Safety Committee, are expected to be sent to everyone that gets the call sheet for the day. This was not done as required, and this is just one of the many safety protocols that were not followed that day. So we allege in our lawsuit that the events that led to the shooting by Mr. Baldwin of a loaded gun do not constitute just simple negligence on Alec Baldwin's part or the producers of Rust. Instead, in our opinion, Mr. Baldwin chose to play Russian roulette when he fired the gun without checking it and without having the armorer demonstrate in his presence that this gun was safe and did not contain live bullets. So his behavior and that of the producers, and he is also a producer as well as an actor, a producer of Rust, was reckless. And the fact that live ammunition was allowed on a movie set, the guns and ammunition were left unattended on a cart and allowed to be handled by those who had no business in handling them, the fact that safety bulletins were not promulgated or ignored makes this a case where injury or death was much more than just a possibility. It was a likely result.
We can understand now why some of those workers on the set, the union members, were walking off. We're speaking with Gloria ALLRED, who represents script supervisor Mamie Mitchell for the film Rust, and of course that is the setting for that film, the death of Helena Hutchins, and of course the injury of Joel Souza, as well as Mamie Mitchell being right there. I was reading, according to the lawsuit, her ears were ringing. It was a deafening sound. And she had also said from the lawsuit that there was not even supposed to be a firearm discharged that day.
Well, yeah, she's the script supervisor.
Yeah.
And she knows what was next on the script. And the answer is that, first of all, this didn't even happen during a rehearsal, let alone the filming of the motion picture.
Wow.
This was Mr. Baldwin practicing for what would be the camera shots. The rehearsal had not started. Here's the proof. The proof is that if a rehearsal had been called, and that's what it's called in this industry, There would have been a slate, and it would have had the
Right.
number of the next script page, which would have been 118C, on the slate. And then the slate would have been closed. That never happened. In addition, that if a gun was supposed to be discharged in that next scene, 118C, Mamie Mitchell and many of the other crew members would not even have been allowed to be inside of that small church when the gun was discharged, because safety protocols would have required that they be outside of the church and monitoring it on an external monitor rather than being close. And she was within 4 feet of Mr. Baldwin when the gun was discharged. So no, he was not even supposed to discharge the gun in the scene, let alone have it discharged in a practice session before a rehearsal.
We're speaking with Gloria ALLRED, who represents script supervisor for Rust, the film, unfortunately, which it doesn't look like it's going to be finished at this point, the horrible tragedy that took place with Helena Hutchins. Of course, the Alec Baldwin had discharged. He fired that gun, and it killed the cinematographer. It injured the director. Who's ultimately, Gloria, and explain this, I'm not familiar with how sets run. Who is ultimately responsible for how that set operates, how it runs? And you were mentioning some of the safety protocols. Who's responsible for running that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the producers are responsible for making sure that the workplace, and that's what a set is, it's a workplace for human beings, whether it's crew members or the actor or anybody else. They have a responsibility. And so that's why I mentioned that Alec Baldwin had a responsibility, not just as an actor, but as a producer.
Yeah. How is Mamie Mitchell today? How is your client today? I know this has obviously been incredibly traumatic for her.
It is. And, you know, she is still traumatized by this whole situation. And it's just very upsetting to her. And she's been in this business, Dana, for more than 40 years. She's been on many film sets in which guns were used in the filming. And all of those 40 years as a script supervisor, she has never once ever seen an assistant director hand a firearm to an actor. It's just not supposed to be done. It's the armorer's responsibility to hand it to the actor, to make sure that it is secure and not loaded, and then demonstrate it to the actor before she hands it to him. And if it's not demonstrated to him, then he needs to look himself,
right,
to make sure that this gun is, you know, either contains dummies or blanks, but certainly not a live bullet.
Right. Last question for you. We're talking with Gloria ALLRED, and we appreciate your time today representing Mamie Mitchell and discussing this case as it relates to the shooting on the set of the film Rust. I'd seen some reports that Mr. Baldwin had cocked the revolver. It's an old revolver. That I had seen some reports that he had cocked it, had his finger maybe in the trigger guard. Do you know any details about this? What can you tell us from what your client experienced and saw?
Well, you know, whether it's old or whether it is a remake,
right,
of a gun to look as though it is old is, I think, at this point, an open question. But certainly it was a gun that was working.
Yes.
Whether it was old and new to be made to look like it's old. And that's what led to this terrible tragedy. She's a hero, Mamie. She ran out. She made that 911 call, you know, to get help. She loved and admired Helena Hutchins. She's just heartbroken for the loss of her new friend and also a respected colleague, and just very upset about what happened to her, you know, her director as well, Joel Souza. And it just remains traumatic. She's cooperated, and immediately when the detectives asked to speak to her, she spoke to them and did the interview with them, and she's cooperated with everything anyone has asked her to do. And so, you know, we're going to wait and see what kind of justice can be won, but certainly there should also be
right,
justice for Mamie Mitchell.
40 years that she's been on sets, and with so many films that are made every single year, not just in California, but all around the world, where you have firearms on sets, and you rarely have these incidents, and that's because of the safety protocols on these sets. That's why you rarely have these incidents that take place. Gloria ALLRED, representing Mamie Mitchell, the script supervisor for the film Rust. Our prayers are with the family of the Hutchins, and of course Mr. Sousa's recovery, as well as your client, Ms. Mitchell, as well, because I can't imagine what that experience has been like for her. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll be watching.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you.
You can watch the full interview on my Dana Radio YouTube page or official Dana Lash on Facebook. Coming up, yesterday the Supreme Court heard arguments in the Mississippi abortion case that challenges Roe v. Wade. I'll break down some of those key aspects next. Stay with us. Thanks to Biden's economic policies, job numbers are still abysmal and inflation is still skyrocketing. And instead of following the former president's pro-business agenda that had the economy booming, Biden wants to tax corporations and pass trillion-dollar bills we can't pay for. It's still time for you to take proactive steps to protect your wealth in retirement by investing in gold and precious metals, and legacy precious metals can help. Washington prints money to pay for their outrageous bills, but all that does is devalue your dollar. Gold offers you a hedge against inflation, and as the dollar gets weaker, gold gets stronger. The folks at Legacy Precious Metals are the gold standard when it comes to investing in precious metals, and they have a team of experts who can counsel you on the best options for you and your family. Don't leave your retirement to chance. Call Legacy Precious Metals at 866-580-2088 or visit them online to download their free investor's guide full of useful information at legacypminvestments.com. Yesterday, the Supreme Court heard arguments in the most consequential abortion case since Roe v. Wade. The case, DOBBS versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, presents the court with the opportunity to overturn Roe and correct, and actually Casey too, and correct one of the most politicized acts in judicial history. The Supreme Court's conservative majority on Wednesday signaled that it might uphold the 15-week ban on abortion that Mississippi passed, and it might go further to establish Mississippi as a substitute for Roe. That would be a huge change in decades. Now, this is both an argument over jurisdiction and an examination over the bastardization definition of privacy. So quickly, top line of the key aspects in this case. First, you're going to hear a lot about this legal concept called stare decisis. And this is simply just a legal concept that prior ruling and precedents should factor into a court's decision about a particular case. It's not a command. So for pro-Roe v. Wade folks, they're insisting on stare decisis to assert incorrectly, I think, that the Supreme Court must stand by things decided. That's what the Latin is roughly translated to, meaning Roe v. Wade as they consider this Mississippi case. But of course, stare decisis means nothing of the sort. It just simply means that judges it's just a doctrine of taking this into account. That's all it does. It does not bind anyone to make the same ruling. In fact, even Judge Kavanaugh has rightly pointed out that if stare decisis it was followed so strictly that judges would be obligated to rule as they have in the past, that Brown v. Board of Education and many other landmark cases would have been wrongly decided. Which leads to the second point. It's important to emphasize the Supreme Court's right to rule differently on abortion rights than they have in the past in light of these specious grounds with which Roe v. Wade became the law of the land. Remember, there's nothing in the Constitution about a right to abortion. What happened with Roe v. Wade was that a very political, left-leaning court simply fabricated a right out of the ether. They legislated. They claimed that abortion somehow was constitutional because of the stretch of the term privacy, citing the 14th Amendment. But it wasn't based on a solid reading of the law. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Justice Ginsburg, decried the shaky foundation on which Roe v. Wade was decided. And yesterday, during oral arguments, Justice Clarence Thomas immediately asked, where is the right to abortion in the Constitution? The answer was that it doesn't exist. The third important point that you should know is a major problem with Roe from a constitutional perspective is that the court took a right, made up a right that appears nowhere in the Constitution, and they turned it into what's considered a fundamental right, when instead this is something that is civil. It should be left to states to determine. And what the left screams, of course, is that if Mississippi's abortion ban at 15 weeks is upheld, that all abortion is going to be criminalized everywhere. But in actuality, upholding Mississippi's 15-week ban on abortion actually just returns power to states to legislate laws. And that's where the power would belong. And for all the people who say, oh, well, that's horrible, that means it would be different state to state. Hi, welcome to the Second Amendment, where I can't carry my gun in California, but I can here in Texas, right? Blue California can simply enact its own laws that would be quite different from red Mississippi's. And the final point to understand is this: anything less than the Supreme Court fully upholding Roe v. Wade, the left is going to be enraged about. And they'll say that women are going to die on the streets everywhere if the Supreme Court upholds Mississippi's law, as if the only way to save a mother's life after 15 weeks is to somehow kill the baby, which is an absolute witch doctor lie. No decent doctor in our modern era century would allow a woman would first off, you would be able to identify any risks. And we have so many modern techniques for determining any kind of risk or future problems with pregnancies. You have amniotic testing, you have ultrasounds, et cetera. I mean, for instance, ectopic pregnancies, which renders the fetus essentially unviable, and it creates a really risky pregnancy. You have the fetus you have the baby in a very inhospitable location. And that's, I mean, we unfortunately don't have the technological advances to save that. I know that's often trotted out by pro Roe v. Wade people as some kind of hypocritical stance from pro-life people, which doesn't make sense. Basically, you have a bunch of witch doctors who think, I guess, that we should still use leeches and do bloodletting. So that's where all of this, I guess, logic comes from. So stop with the whole women are going to die in the streets everywhere argument. And also with the what about rape and incest argument, rape and incest count for barely 1% of all abortion cases. And fine, let's have the conversation about the 1% if it saves the 99%, right? Especially when the phrase used to be safe, legal, and rare, and now it's safe and legal and taxpayer funded, all access all the time, right? So we're gonna follow this case in the coming weeks and months ahead. Arguments return on Monday. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.